back your hard copies on Tuesday. So just look out for a Blackboard posting. Generally speaking, I keep that course information in that section on Moodle, on Blackboard. So what you'll see are two things. You'll see your raw score, which is out of 36. And then what you will see is a score which has been converted to a mark of 20, which is the 20%, which is what this exam is worth. Any questions about that before we continue?
You can't see it today?
Today, no, I don't have the exams with me. You're going to get them back on Tuesday. Now, next thing, your assignments. What you're going to have today is a short lecture, and then I'm going to be giving you your last tutorial assignment, which is going to be related to internet management. I'm going to give you the rest of the class to complete this assignment. It's sort of a research-based assignment. And then we're going to go over that in class together next Tuesday. It's going to be part of our overall discussion of issues of management and control. Any questions about that before we continue? That's already been posted for you on Blackboard and emailed to you as well. But I'm going to go over those questions with you before the end of class to give you a few hints about where those answers can be found.
For the tutorial assignment, the non-government organization, can it be the U.S. or it has to be the...
I'll explain all of it during,
Okay.
when I talk about the assignment. Okay, so today's discussion is continuing by exploring one of those themes I tell you about time and time again, and that is the theme of users shaping new technology. Our discussion of personal computers is really all about this discussion of users shaping new technology, and it represents to us, just like the telephone and the radio, a great example of unintended consequences and how a specific group of users can play a huge role in shaping a system. Now, the thing I want you to first understand is that our lecture today is not about the history of computers per se. We could have an entire course on that. And I'm not even going to be talking about the history of personal computers as you know them, the kinds of devices that will be sold to the public by groups like IBM and Apple in the 1980s forward. Instead, think of this almost as a prehistory of personal computing. And what we are going to do is examine how a specific group of users, in this case, the computer hobbyists, played a huge role in shaping some of these earliest systems. Our lecture today is going to explore, for instance, 5 major areas of development. These will include things like shaping or creating user networks or networks of information, creating the first manufacturing companies associated with personal computers, having a major impact on hardware and software advancements, leaving an imprint on the technology, and finally, I will introduce you to a new idea called lead users and how important lead users can be in any new system. Now, one of the things I want you to recognize in our lecture today is that our story really begins in the late 60s and 1970s, and at the time, there were only 2 major types of computers that were around and that people were familiar with. The first kind of computer is what we call a mainframe computer. And mainframe computers were extremely big systems. These were the types of computers, for instance, that could fill an entire office floor. So you can imagine their size and scale. The second type of computer that people were familiar with were called mini computers. But do not confuse the term mini back then with the term mini today. Mini computers back then were still really large instruments. They were still very large systems. The only difference is that they did not take up the space or capacity of those mainframe computers I talked about before. So this is important to understand the types of computers that people were familiar with during this period of time. And therefore, our story is all about figuring out how we are going to get to a place where people will begin to use personal or small-scale computers with microprocessor technology. So the first thing I want you to think about then are these computer hobbyists, the main actors in our story today. And in many ways, we will see a lot of familiarities with these computer hobbyists if we compare them to our discussion last class of the amateur radio operators. Now, just like the amateur radio operators, computer hobbyists were extremely skilled and extremely knowledgeable individuals. But importantly, of course, they were also individuals who knew much more about computers than the everyday average person. These people had a level of skill and knowledge well beyond what most were used to. Now, an interesting survey was done in the 1970s, where a survey of over 1,500 of these computer hobbyists took place in North America. And I've given you some of the results of these surveys in your notes, so that you can begin to understand just exactly how passionate computer hobbyists were in terms of these systems. Now, in your notes, for example, one of the things you will see is that computer hobbyists were willing to spend a lot of time tinkering with computers in their spare time. For example, some would spend 10 to 20 hours a week on this particular hobby. And remember, when we talk about hobbies and amateurs, we're talking about people who work with these systems with no expectation of pay. So they're doing this outside work. A smaller number, but still a big percentage, 13%, were willing to spend 30 to 40 hours on their hobbies outside of work, which means for some, this was the equivalent of a full-time job in terms of total hours. Now, one of the things I want you to understand is that one reason why these computer hobbyists were so knowledgeable is because many of them, in fact, worked in the computer industry. It's important to understand that in those days, computers were not really present in most businesses, and in fact, the types of areas you were likely to find, both mainframe and mini computers, were areas like government and large-scale industry. So, where did most of these computer hobbyists work? They worked in these locations, in big business, with governments, or within the computer industry itself. And this is where they learned most of their knowledge. However, consider these people would then go back to their homes after a day's work and then spend even more time in their garage or basement or kitchen working on computers. Now, time is one thing, money of course is something else, but yet again we see people who are willing to invest a great deal in their outside hobby or interests. For example, over 30% of those computer hobbyists surveyed in the 1970s were willing to spend thousands of dollars on computer systems, when of course thousands of dollars is still a lot of money. Some of them willing to spend up to 10 to 20% of their annual income. That's like taking whatever you make a year and putting 20% of it on your hobby. That should tell you a great deal about just how invested these computer hobbyists were. Now, one of the most important things that I want to emphasize to you today, however, is that when we look at the reasons behind the passion associated with computer hobbyists, it's important to recognize that for many of these individuals, computers were more than just simply machines. And part of the reason why they were so enthusiastic about this technology was because they believed, in large part, that computers could be instrumental in bringing about social change. In other words, computers were not just objects, they were not just things, they saw them as major tools for changing the world. Part of this stems from the time period we are talking about, of course. Many of these computer hobbyists were children of the 1960s, where, of course, in places like North America, there was a great deal of social, economic, and political change going on. And as a result, many of these hobbyists firmly believed that they could put an end to things like gender inequality or racial inequality simply if more people had access to these computers. However, just like our amateur radio operators, these hobbyists were also extremely anti-authority, very anti-government, very anti-industry. And part of the reason why they criticized the government and industry a great deal was because at the time, they thought that computers were being unfairly monopolized by these groups. It goes back to what I just said. Computers could be found mostly within governments and industry. These hobbyists thought that this was unfair, that these groups were unfairly controlling computers, preventing them from getting into the hands of the everyday average person. And they thought, for example, that in the future, if more people had access to computers, then this was, in fact, the first step in bringing about great social and organizational change. So clearly, for these hobbyists, computers are a lot more than just mere computers. Now, in addition to understanding who these computer hobbyists were, I want to briefly tell you about some of the technological advancements that were also happening in the computer industry during this time. Advancements that will in many ways set the stage for moving forward with this idea of small-scale computing. Now, as I mentioned to you previously, most computers in the 1960s and 1970s were of the mainframe and mini-computer variety. However, there were major advancements happening in other fields, fields that would be crucial, for example, for this idea of a personal computer. One area, for instance, to think about are advancements that was happening in the semiconductor industry and in the integrated circuit industry. Now, when we talk about integrated circuit technology, the very first industry to fully incorporate and use this kind of technology was in fact the calculator industry. Because in the late 60s and early 70s, it was actually the calculator industry which introduced to the public the very first personal calculators. Now, we use and think of personal calculators as nothing today. But again, when you look at the trajectory, they're not really that old, so to speak. So in any case, personal calculators. Why are they important to our story of personal computers? Think of it this way. Personal calculators were the first devices to use this type of integrated circuit technology. And because the public saw them and was extremely enthusiastic about them, they were buying them up in droves, as you can imagine. Once personal calculators found a marketplace, people in the integrated circuit industry also saw a potential market. They saw a market for other products that might contain integrated circuits, and they also recognized that if this was the case, they would be able to mass produce integrated circuits, make them cheaper, and over time make these products cheaper when offering them to the general consumer. Now, our story of computers also has another calculator link, because it was a calculator company called Visicom around this time who actually approached a very well-known computer company, the company Intel, which of course is still around today. Intel was again asked at this point by Visicom to create for them a series of specialized integrated circuit chips. But what Intel ended up creating instead, and this is very important, was a series of general-purpose integrated circuit chips. This series of chips, for example, included a microprocessor chip. It also included a memory chip. And at this point, Intel is going to begin to advertise this series of chips as including a microprogrammable computer on a chip. This idea of creating this series of general-purpose chips resulted in Intel's 4004 series, which will move to the 8008 series and eventually the 8800 series, and you'll find these numbers in your notes. All they simply mean is that the technology gets more advanced and more powerful. So 8800 was a more powerful version of the 4004 series. Now, what Intel was able to do then with this series of chips was to negotiate a deal with Visicom, which is going to allow them to sell these general-purpose chips to other industries. But of course now, the availability of a microprocessor chip is going to be vital when we talk about understanding further developments in the computing industry and how we are slowly moving forward in terms of smaller scale computers. Now, one of the things I want you to recognize in our story is an attempt to try to figure out why hobbyists play such a huge role in shaping this technology. Because of course, as I've just mentioned to you, there was already a computer industry established at this time. So if this is the case, why are we going to focus so much on these hobbyists in the early development of personal computers? The answer to this is when we start to look at the philosophy of the computer industry in those days. And when we begin to recognize something interesting. The fact at the time, for example, that the computer industry in those days did not necessarily see a future or even a market for personal computers. Think about this for a minute as many of you, writing it down on your personal computers. There was a time when the computer industry did not envision a need for the everyday average person to have personal computers. They did not think there would ever be a market, in other words, for these devices. So of course, one of the things we need to answer in our story today is why. Why did they have this kind of mentality? And part of the answer comes from the general philosophy which was present in the computer industry in the 60s and into the 1970s. Remember at the time, and I keep emphasizing this to you, computers in those days were large-scale devices. People were used to dealing with things like mainframe computers and mini-computers. And in those days, the computer industry was used to this type of system, and they also thought that the future would continue to remain with large-scale computers. They thought this is how things were always going to be done. In fact, one of the things that the computer industry believed that would happen down the future was the idea of using computers, large-scale computers, in a kind of timeshare capacity. So for example, if an individual wants to use a computer for, let's say, calculation purposes, the computer industry envisioned a time where they would use computers by sharing them amongst each other. They would incorporate it like a timeshare, just like you do a condo. You take the computer, you use it for whatever you need, someone else uses the same computer for other purposes. But this philosophy again highlights the fact they did not think that an individual would really need a computer on their own. And that was, in fact, the majority in the computer industry at the time. This is how the majority felt. In fact, when we start to look at examples of this kind of thinking in the computer industry, we come across some very famous examples, especially when we get to a company, for instance, like Xerox. Now, if I were to ask you today what Xerox is best known for producing, what's the most common answer? Photocopiers, not computers. And yet, this might not necessarily have been true back then. Xerox, in fact, in the 60s and early 70s, was at the forefront of some of this earliest personal computer experimentation. Xerox researchers, for example, were doing a lot of experiments with personal computers in their main research labs at Palo Alto, California. And in fact, what Xerox had created back then was really the very first prototype personal computer, a computer they called the Alto. Back then, the Alto actually had many features we still use with computers today. A memory drive, a keyboard, a mouse. It was, in fact, labeled by Xerox as being a very important part of the office of the future. And in fact, that's how it was highlighted. But, and we understand now why, the industry executives and marketers at Xerox decided not to pursue this kind of research any further. They decided instead to adopt more of a wait-and-see approach to personal computers at the time. Simply, again, because they did not believe there would actually be a market for these kinds of devices. And by the time the market was established and industry players like Apple or IBM are going to come to the forefront, it was way too late for Xerox. They, as many economic historians have said, missed the boat or missed a prime opportunity. And it is why Xerox has often been studied as having seriously miscalculated in terms of the early development of personal computers. Still, we can't blame Xerox entirely for this way of thinking, simply because, as I said earlier, this is how the majority of the industry was thinking about computers at the time. Now, I mentioned to you that computer hobbyists were extremely passionate about computers generally. And we also know now that there was, at the time, the advent of these Intel series of chips, which we just talked about. But one of the other things we need to understand is that although Intel had created this series of general purpose chips, they were really only selling these chips to major industries. And it was actually very difficult initially for computer hobbyists to get their hands on these chips, even if they wanted to do so. Accessibility, in other words, was a major issue. But so was money. Because by the time we get to using that 8800 series of chips, like I talked about previously, we need to recognize just how expensive they were. Intel was selling these chips for about $360 each, which, although the computer hobbyists might, again, have been willing to pay, was still not necessarily cheap and not necessarily easily accessible by this particular group. So what we need to figure out next then are how these computer hobbyists managed to get their hands on a system which will incorporate this Intel series of chips. And the answer to this takes us to what most historians refer to as the very first personal computer. A computer that we are going to discuss at great length, a device which we call the Altair. Now the Altair was first introduced to computer hobbyists around January of 1975, and it was marketed in the very well-known magazine Popular Electronics. It is around this time, for example, where a company like MITS came to the forefront, Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. MITS was a new company led by a man named Ed Roberts. Interestingly, Roberts had spent some time in the calculator business before moving his way into the computer industry. And what Roberts was able to do, which is so important in our story of the Altair, was to negotiate a deal with Intel during this time. He was able to negotiate a deal with Intel so that instead of this 8800 series costing $360, he was able to purchase this series for only $75. And what this means is that they, MITS, could now sell the Altair to computer hobbyists for the grand total of about $400, a very reasonable sum. And that's exactly what starts to happen in January of 1975. MITS advertised this new computer to rival commercial models. They highlighted, for example, the fact that computer hobbyists, if they sent in their $400 plus shipping and handling, could get a system or a machine that would, in fact, allow them to get in their hands a real computer. And this proved to be extraordinarily popular with computer hobbyists. Within just a few short months, MITS is going to have thousands and thousands of orders to fill. In fact, they were so overwhelmed by the demand for the Altair that they will start having problems trying to fill all of these orders. There is no denying, no doubt, that computer hobbyists loved this idea of the Altair, and they were buying up these systems in droves. But the one thing I want to suggest to you is that for probably 99.9% of the people in this room, the Altair would probably have not been a very interesting machine to purchase. And that is because when we think about the Altair, that very first personal computer back then, we need to understand just how different it is from the kinds of systems you're used to today. In fact, I can draw you the Altair. That's exactly what it looked like. The Altair was a box. It was either a black box or a silver box with a bunch of buttons on the front. There was no monitor, no keyboard, no memory, no nothing. It was simply a box that the computer hobbyist could manipulate. And in fact, the most even a skilled hobbyist could do with the Altair initially was to program it so that one of the light bulbs flashed on and off. That's it. That's all they could do with the Altair. And that's why I suggest to you, most of you probably wouldn't have been terribly interested in this kind of device. But we need to figure out then what made the Altair so attractive to these computer hobbyists. And the answer to this lies in the architecture of the Altair. The Altair was based, for example, on a system which we call bus architecture, B-U-S-S. And this is a very important part of our story. Bus architecture simply means open-ended architecture. It's a system, for instance, that is easily manipulated. A system where you can add on to it whatever you like. In other words, the Altair was this open-ended system because of its bus architecture. And it meant that computer hobbyists could take a basic black box and then add to it whatever they wanted. And that's exactly what they did. They added different accessories, things like keyboards and monitors and memory drive, just to give you a few examples. And of course, they could do this because of their high level of skill and knowledge. And now we can also go back again to the amount of money these hobbyists were willing to spend. Because what initially could cost them $400 might at the end cost them $3,000, $4,000, or $5,000 by the time they were finished with this system. And this ability to manipulate the Altair, the ability to add anything because of its open-ended nature, is one of the primary reasons why this system proved to be so popular. Another reason has to do with marketing. We've talked a lot about marketing over the last couple of classes, especially with any new system. We talked about the early marketing of the telephone, how early radio was marketed to consumers as well. And yet again, we see how marketing can prove to be extremely important in the success of any new system. Now, in the case of the Altair, what I want to turn your attention to is the ways in which MITS promoted this particular system, and in fact, how they did so quite cleverly. For instance, in your notes, you will see the following type of advertisement that was commonplace with MITS. They claimed that the Altair was, and I quote, the world's first microcomputer kit to rival commercial models. Who could tell me the significance of this? Why would this type of advertisement be so appealing to computer hobbyists? I'll repeat it. World's first microcomputer kit to rival commercial models. It goes against governments and big business. What these computer hobbyists were told was that they were getting in their hands a real, full-blown computer, something that could rival the commercial systems that, at the time, they thought were being monopolized by big business and government. In other words, the computer hobbyists were being told that for the first time, they could get their hands on a real computer. Emphasize this, a real one. Not a toy, not a numbers cruncher, not a glorified calculator, but a real, serious system. And this was extremely appealing to a group, of course, that had been wanting to get their hands on this kind of device for so long. In fact, this idea is what made the Altair so popular, especially amongst hobbyists in North America. And one of the reasons we can see this is by comparing it to the relative lack of success of similar systems in other parts of the world. For example, some computer historians have compared the popularity of the Altair in North America to other systems in places like Britain, which never really took off. And one of the claims they have often made is that in North America, the Altair proved to be extremely successful simply because it was marketed in this particular way, as a serious, full-blown computer. In contrast, in places like Britain, these devices continued to be advertised or marketed as part of a general hobby or as a kind of toy. And as a result, they never received that kind of appeal, or never had that kind of appeal. Another thing that MITS was able to do, and did very well, was to engage the computer hobbyists by often promoting different types of contests and campaigns. These kinds of contests, for example, urged computer hobbyists to come up with the latest add-on or the latest accessory to the Altair system. And they were told that whoever could come up with the best device would get a prize. In this case, gift certificates to purchase more MITS products. But here, I want you to think about why these kinds of contests were so brilliant. By, for example, let's say playing on the skills, knowledge, and of course ego of these computer hobbyists. What was MITS essentially making these computer hobbyists?
Skilled workers.
Well, they're making them skilled workers. They're making them they're giving them more room for innovation.
Loyalists to their company?
They're going to actually move away from loyalty pretty quickly. Not necessarily consumers. Free workers, but in a particular area. Research and development. They made computer hobbyists, basically, their own R&D division. Why did MITS have to invest in R&D when these computer hobbyists were doing them, and in the early days, doing it for free, out of a love for the system? So again, these kinds of things allow us to better understand just why the Altair was so popular. Now, by putting all of this together, we can now begin to better understand these 5 key areas of users shaping new technology that I highlighted to you at the beginning of class. And the first area to think about is how these hobbyists were able to set up user networks, or what I call networks of communication. One of the things, for instance, to understand about computer hobbyists is that they thought it was very important to spread the word in terms of understanding computers generally, and more specifically, understanding these Altair systems. One of the things, for instance, to highlight goes back to the fact that initially, MITS was overwhelmed with a lot of their orders. They had thousands of orders to fill, and they weren't really expecting this kind of demand. Well, as a result, one of the big problems computer hobbyists had was that when they used to purchase a MITS product, oftentimes the Altair would come to their house with missing parts, with missing instructions, or it wouldn't even work the way it was supposed to. So setting up networks of communication become vital to these computer hobbyists. They began to set up weekly meetings with each other in people's basements and kitchens and garages. They began to share their information by creating pamphlets and journals and other ways, for instance, where they could talk to each other and try to figure out and solve all of the problems they were having. This ability to communicate with each other, this ability to share information with each other, was vital for these computer hobbyists, and vital in terms of helping them to understand and better understand these new systems. And many computer hobbyists, for example, in their weekly meetings with their fellow hobbyists, are going to end up using this as a starting point for what many computer historians have called the development of Silicon Valley down the road. In other words, what started off as a weekly meeting in someone's basement is going to turn into a multi-million-dollar company as this new personal computer industry begins to take off. Not only did these computer hobbyists then believe in the importance of sharing information, even more vital is the fact that they thought information should always be shared freely as well. In other words, the prevailing philosophy amongst computer hobbyists during this time was that information should be shared without pay, without cost. People should just get that information for free. They shouldn't have to pay for it at all. And again, when we talk about the computing sort of industry today, when we talk about a subset of those who use computers, we can see this philosophy continues to remain strong and true. That idea, for instance, a belief amongst many, that you really shouldn't be paying for some of the stuff you see, not just within the hardware, but in terms of computer software and things you find online. Where does this idea come from? It goes all the way back to that prevailing philosophy amongst computer hobbyists. Now, let's talk about the second area, establishing new manufacturing companies. And to understand this, we go back to two areas we briefly explored before. The first is the problems MITS was having with filling orders. Many computer hobbyists, for instance, were becoming increasingly frustrated with MITS' inability to send them working products. And this was also coupled by the frustration many computer hobbyists had by the fact that the established computer industry at this time was not terribly interested in pursuing this idea of small-scale computing. Put these two ideas together, and we start to see why so many of these computer hobbyists end up quitting their jobs in major corporations and government and start to set up their own manufacturing companies related to personal computers. If you take a look at your notes, you will see that in less than a year, over 50 of these manufacturing companies had been established, primarily by computer hobbyists. And one of the reasons why they were able to do so again goes back to the fact that the Altair was built using bus architecture. It was an open-ended system. You could essentially create whatever you wanted for the system at the time. Now, if we take a look at some of the names of these early computer companies, they too reflect the laid-back attitude, for example, of these hobbyists we're talking about. You can see Loving Grace Cybernetics and Kentucky Fried Computers were two of the earliest companies around. And this alone should tell you this was not necessarily a group that takes themselves very seriously. However, one thing that is serious about this part of the story is that we can see again how these hobbyists are shaping the early systems. They are creating some of these companies that again will lead or be vital for the foundations of places like Silicon Valley in California down the road. Next, let's get to creating new hardware and new software. And it is here that we can again attempt to understand this question I posed to you earlier about why the established computer industry initially saw no market for personal computers. Now, to understand this, let's first talk about a major invention associated with this system, a programming language that was invented and that will facilitate, for instance, the creation of software applications for the Altair. This new programming language that was created was called BASIC, and it was devised by two men, names familiar to you, Bill Gates and Paul Allen. Gates and Allen, of course, of Microsoft fame, actually came from this computer hobbyist culture that we've been talking about. They were able, within a very short period of time, to devise this programming language BASIC, and then they negotiated with Roberts to sell BASIC alongside the Altair. Well, ironically, when they devised BASIC, this signaled the beginning of a major rift between Gates and Allen and the rest of the hobbyist community. Because what Gates and Allen, of course, wanted was for these hobbyists to purchase BASIC alongside the Altair. And of course, that was the last thing these hobbyists were willing to do. They believed everything should be offered for free. And one of the things they did, which ended up angering Gates and Allen, was of course having one person purchase BASIC and having everybody else copy the program for free. So BASIC proves to be vital in advancing these personal computing systems. And it was extremely important because it's going to allow down the road for the advent of software for these systems. And when we talk about software, what are exactly we referring to? We're referring to the reasons why people generally use computers even today. Spreadsheets, computational software, word processing software, the very reasons why computers are popular today. And this is where I want you to start thinking about why the computer industry itself soon will have a change of heart in terms of its approach to personal computers. When personal computers like the Altair were simply black or silver boxes with a bunch of buttons on the front, where the most you could do was program a light bulb to go on and off, the general, everyday, average person would have had no interest in the system. But thanks to the advent of software applications, all of a sudden the computer industry sees a potential new marketplace for these devices. They start to see the very real possibilities of an unskilled person being interested in computers because of what computers can provide them with. And that is something we have to understand about computers generally. Most of us in this room could care less about the machine itself. The reason why computers are so important to us is because of the software, what in fact they can provide us with. And the ability to create new software applications in large part helps us to understand why the established computer market or industry started to see the potential for these systems and why they will now begin to pursue these systems much more enthusiastically than they had before. Next, I want you to think about the fourth area we've talked about in terms of users shaping new technology. A very important idea which I call lead users. Now, for those of you who don't necessarily know what this term means, it's kind of self-explanatory. A lead user are the first people who get their hands on a system and use the system. They are first in line. They are the lead user. And in the case of personal computers, we can really see how these computer hobbyists could be classified as lead users. But the reason why this is important in our story of users shaping new technology goes back to the fact that these particular computer hobbyists had a much higher level of skill and knowledge than the everyday average person. And because they were then the first to use the system, one of the things they could do was to advance the system. They could improve upon personal computing technology by using their skills and knowledge. They could eliminate some of the kinks, some of the early technical glitches associated with these systems and make them better. And they would not have been able to do this had they not had a higher level of knowledge and understanding than the everyday average person. So why is this going to be important then in the overall success of personal computers? Think of it this way. As lead users, hobbyists can get their hands on the system or have their hands on the system first. They can eliminate a lot of the technical glitches, they can make a lot of improvements, they advance the technology. So much so that by the time industry gets their hands on these systems and starts to market personal computers to the general public, what was the general public receiving? An improved system, a more advanced system than they would have had without the role or work of computer hobbyists. And when we think about computers, imagine how important this would have been. Early average consumers of personal computers generally tended to be small businesses and other groups of this nature. The last thing they would have done then is to purchase a system full of technical holes and glitches. It wouldn't have been in their best interest. But what they ended up getting instead was a relatively advanced system, thanks in large part to what these computer hobbyists were able to accomplish. Now finally, we get to this idea of leaving an imprint on a technology. And what I mean by this really is to leave a legacy. And the legacy we're talking about goes back to what computer hobbyists loved most about these systems. They loved the open bus architecture. They loved the open-ended nature of computer systems. The reason why this is important is because we need to recognize today computers are still very much open-ended systems. They are very much based on this concept of bus architecture. You, as an individual, can take a computer and you can manipulate it any way you want. You can add more power to it, you can add accessories to it, you can create the device in the best way you see fit. And you can do this because computers, as I said, continue to remain open-ended systems, a lasting legacy from these computer hobbyists. In fact, in your notes, I give you an example of the Apple II, one of Apple's biggest failures as a computer on the marketplace, where in the 1980s they tried to sell a system that essentially was closed. It was a closed source system. Users could not manipulate it. It proved to be one of their least selling items. And so today, as back then, when we think of computers, think of the importance of open bus architecture. For those of you who'd like to try it yourself, go to a website like howstuffworks.com. On the website, in about 3 or 4 installments, you can actually figure out how to make your own computer. And it's really not as hard as you might think. It just involves putting some stuff together, but it's not as difficult as you might imagine, and it goes back to this whole idea of creating a system for your own needs. So if we put all of these ideas together, there are a number of things to consider. The first, as I mentioned to you, is why I called this a prehistory of personal computing. We can clearly see that when we talk about the development of personal computers amongst the general public, something that really started to happen in the 1980s and going into the 1990s, a lot of these events were shaped long before these computers hit the marketplace. These systems were in fact largely shaped by a group like these computer hobbyists, a group you will read further about in one of the articles I've given for you today. And just like we've seen with our examples of the telephone and radio, it is a clear idea of shaping new technology in different ways. Are there any questions about this particular case study before I get into your last tutorial assignment? Okay, so just a couple of things, reminders. I mentioned to you at the beginning of class, your tests have now been marked. What I'm going to be doing when I get home tonight is to post those marks on Blackboard for you. You'll find them in the section called Course Information, and you'll see 2 marks posted, one your raw score out of 36, and the other mark out of 20, which is what this first test represents. The second thing, is the assignment I'm going to be giving you. I can't seem to do, I've been locked out of the system.
Computers.
The assignment should be no longer than about 1 or 2 pages, single-spaced, no title pages. Answer each question separately, and make sure to include your name, your student number, and your section number, FBO, as you give them to me next Tuesday. So the assignment is all about internet management and control. And before we begin, nobody yell it out, how many of you actually think you know the question or answer to the question of who controls the internet today?
The organization.
Yeah, you don't need to don't say it out loud, but how many of you think you know the answer? Couple. Not a lot, considering the internet is the most widely spread, widely used system. And it's always a concern when we think about the most educated in our society having no clue about who controls this major system. So hopefully, we get answers to these questions by looking at the following 4 questions I want you to find out about. This question or assignment on internet control can be found, ironically enough, by doing a little bit of online research, and you will come across the answers to these questions by keeping in mind the following clues. So let's look at question number 1. Which non-governmental organization is responsible for many of the technical decisions related to internet management? 2 keywords here. First, non-governmental. I don't want you to be finding out information about the CRTC, the FCC, the United Nations. You're on the wrong track if you come across those kinds of names. Number 2, technical decisions. So there is a group responsible for the majority of high-level technical decisions related to internet operations generally. Question number 2, why is this organization so controversial? This is key. You'll come across a number of different organizations with lots of different acronyms and letters with their names, but there is only one that is controversial. There is only one that has generated a great deal of debate and controversy, with some actually saying this organization should no longer be in existence. So that's a pretty big hint as well. So figure out that controversial organization. Next, tell me 2 or 3 of the decisions that are controversial this group has made within the last, let's say, 6 years or so. And finally, question number 4, why is it that nobody really knows who controls the internet? You can say, and this is a personal opinion, of course, you can say in your answer, it's because nobody cares, because that is in large part the answer to this question, but tell me why nobody cares. And after reading about this topic, tell me maybe why this is a problem that nobody cares. What we're going to do on Tuesday is as follows. For our lecture on the internet, we are going to start by looking at the history of the system, go into the idea of users shaping new technology, and then after the break, we are going to get into an entire discussion on issues related to internet management and control, which in part will be on this assignment. This is all about studying for your second test, I can tell you now, so make sure that you pay some careful attention to it. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer anything you might